name is Casper de Horst, one of the co-founders of Project IP. Today we're going to take you through the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive. And just to have a quick question to see if you are working on Mentimeter, you could just drop a pin by touching your finger on the map, and then we know where you are to see approximately where you are all attending from today. 31 people. If you haven't signed in a Menti, go to www.menti.com and use the code 19701618 on your mobile phone, and you can join me with a quick Q&A. This English session probably will have people all over the planet joining in. And, but most probably still in the EU. So at least we know Menti is working. That's good. So, just a quick check with you guys what kind of role you have in the supply chain. You can pick more than one, because most of you are probably in more than one. There's a couple of roles that are linked to the EU, but you could also be a non-EU brand or non-EU manufacturer, which is not entirely the same. In fact, manufacturer I would regard here as really production facility. But this is relevant, obviously, also for supply chain roles. Many of you may have read about Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive and think about this. Okay, we are like an SME and we're probably not big enough to start with this immediately. However, you might be the first tier, the number one supplier of a company that actually has to start quite quickly, and they will then present questions to you, because as it is a supply chain, one cannot solve these kind of issues without the help of the other one. It helps to understand supply chain roles, also to, for us to understand what kind of information you would be looking for. Okay, thanks for that. Little quick question: how are you dealing with product compliance these days? Because this is relevant for. This is relevant for dealing with Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive. You cannot disconnect supply chain, sustainability, environment anymore with product compliance. They are integrated already on directive levels. You will see it in the battery legislation that is coming there. You will see it in packaging. You will see it in eco design. So you cannot disconnect one from the other. And those that are running in-house systems and spreadsheets and etc., you will have significant challenge when there are obligations to share information with the public via digital product passport as well. Okay, the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, you could say, deals with CSR, ESG, as we call it, with sustainability and environmental aspects. But it's not just enough to audit factories. And that is, you could say, well, we are joining several programs and we have added our suppliers to a pool and we put them in an audit program. But there's a big difference in this new legislation, and that has to do with the fact that you need to review your policies and see if some of the results, sometimes the negative results that you will have in the supply chain could be as a result of your policies. Yeah? So it's good to use third parties, and I'll come to that later as well. But this directive goes a little bit beyond just standard CSR ESG policies that you have had up till now. Okay, thanks for that. We call this the EU tsunami. As part, this one is part of the a number of sessions that we have this moment, and we call it tsunami because there's really tremendous amount of legislation coming towards us. Are you worried, or do you see it's not a problem at this moment? It seems you cannot vote on this. Let me reload this one. It's the internet, eh? Yeah, you should be able to vote on that. You know, even in the last 2 weeks, you can see the tremendous amount of legislation that is either coming or discussed about greenwashing, about eco design, etc. You know, 93% of you are worried. Well, if 4 of you have voted, then that is the case probably. Yeah, I'm worried too. You know, even at Product IP, we need, it's really a lot of work, and we'll see what comes from that. The basis, the core of this CSRD is actually 17 UN goals, and are you aware of those? Did you know that there were 17? That's something, but I wouldn't consider that as the right answer here. Clear about, have you really, you know, gone over them, gone through them, and if not, you know, it's really time to do that. I will refer to that in the slides. They are really there to stay. They're there for a long time, since early of this century already. So if I say Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, then you can actively type. What do you say? Oh my God, or no way? And this is something you would, what first comes up into your mind when I say that? Let that sink in. Need to know more. Yeah, yeah. Yeah, transparency is correct. Built in. Confused. Do not want to know. Yeah. It's also an answer indeed. Good. Any questions that you currently have? Well, you'll tell me more, then we'll switch to that. You can, I'll leave this page open. You can type them in later as well, and I'll go back to that page later. Okay, so that you can. I'll leave the page open at my side. You just can type them in, and then we'll take it from there. Let's go to the presentation. So, Casper, that's my name. For those who don't know it, I'm one of the 2 founders of Product IP. We are in the meantime with a team of 60 worldwide, and serve a tremendous amount of companies that want to make an effort on product conformity, and in the meantime, supply chain due diligence as well. It's called Product IP because the IP stands for Information Platform, and the IP address, we are a web-based software as a service solution. You might have seen our logo as well on a helmet of a woman from the Netherlands, an athlete called Kimberly Bos, who's very brave, going down on a sledge, skeleton rider, an Olympic bronze medal winner. Why these Compliance Tuesday sessions? Well, the thing starts with knowledge. It starts with knowledge often at your end, because you need to push them internally through your own organization, but also externally to your supply chain. You need to understand what it's about, and often it's just lingo as well. Actually, you did know it already, but you didn't know the word or the language that the legislation is using. We call it tsunami. We don't call it lighthearted. It's a tsunami because tsunami is a terrible thing, but this is in some way a terrible thing because it's really going to hit businesses across the board. And this is just one of the legislation coming away from Station Brussels. Yes, we're going back to Station Brussels, as that we did in the previous sessions. There are 6 platforms at the European Legal Train Station, and these are the main platforms that that are used, as a kind of a way to display what kind of legislation is under development. We are going to focus on platform 1. There's a total of 584 active legal trains at this moment. In order to understand which one are relevant for you, you need to basically read them all. So they're not all relevant for retail and trade, but you need to go through them before you know it. Today we start at the European Green Deal, which is interesting. And the European Green Deal, and we go to the arrived platform, and there we find the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, which arrived end of last year, early of this year. It's green here, 2012 it was green, so it's arrived. Today we are here, it's still arrived. It's not new entirely. The 220-2464 is actually amending legislation from 2014. And companies that had, that were applicable under the NFRD, there were companies with 500 or more people. So some of you, I'm fairly sure, know that you should have been part of the NFRD, but this was like more like a voluntary approach. But those large companies acknowledged that this voluntary approach was really necessary. So what changes fundamentally is that in the new legislation, there's no more voluntarily aspect. It has to become part of a financial annual report. So this is the non-financial part of the financial report. And it has to be signed off by an independent third party, which could be your accountant or some other consultant that you acknowledge for that. Involving third parties means that those third parties actually also become part of liabilities when things are terribly go wrong. And that makes it quite interesting. So the NFRD, this makes it a little bit difficult when you read the CSRD because it refers to amending the NFRD. So it's a little bit, you need to read 2 documents. Large listed companies, banks and insurance companies with more than 500 employees are required to produce reports on the policies they implement in relation to, there you have it, environmental protection, social responsibility, treatment of employees, respect for human rights, anti-corruption, bribery, diversity of company boards. So it's not entirely new. Maybe a surprise for you, but it's the truth. Just to be very clear, this European system with European trains, etc., it's transparent, and you can subscribe even to trains to get notifications when things are happening. You can read about it. It shows who at the EU you can send an email to contact. So who is responsible for these portfolios. It's nothing hidden, and in many cases you can participate. At this moment, the participation rounds are there, open comment rounds on the packaging and waste regulation that is coming. Yeah. Often large organizations, consumer organizations or branch organizations use those comments rounds, obviously, but it's open for individuals as well. I had sent to you in the invite a link to the Welcome to the Anthropocene video, which I'm not going to play now, otherwise we'll lose 4 minutes of the presentation. You can look at it later. Anthropocene is actually let's say a name that we use for the era that we are now in. What struck me when I watched the video is that in this day and age, we as humans, we move more soil and other things from on this planet than the planet itself does via erosion, etc. So we are the ones that shaping basically the landscape of this planet. And I don't have an agenda on this project. It doesn't have an agenda, but it's just I use this video just to ensure that we're all on the same. It's happening, things are happening, and it's not about good or bad. Some of these things really have impact, and we should at least control and are aware of that impact. Yeah, so I'm not going to play that video today. So this CSRD, that is coming from the initial events, the Rio summit, the Glasgow summit, and it's already from 2012, and the link to the video is in the slides. It's not just CSRD, because it is linked to products. So I noticed that some of the companies that we deal with, that actually product compliance responsibility starts to move towards somebody at the board that is responsible for sustainability, which I think it's a good idea. You know, often the sustainability pressure on the supply chain, which could cause a delisting of supply chain partners, is really a pressure point, where sometimes on a order quantity, and you deal with product compliance per order quantity, you might feel that you are not a strong party related to that factory. You buy a quantity that's significant for you, but might not be significant for the factory. However, the sustainability pressure comes to that supply chain from everybody, and losing a status, a preferred status in any program will affect any sales of the factory. Yeah. It's just not something that you can do from behind the desk. It really is a lot of effort. When I made this presentation, I thought by myself, actually, it's not a complex story to tell about, because it all makes sense. But it's like looking into the mirror. It doesn't require a lot of effort to look into the mirror, but I can look in the mirror. I think, oh, Casper, you should lose some weight. And that requires discipline and an effort. Yeah? It will affect, and that is new, not only the large listed companies, but also the non-listed and the SMEs in a particular order. Having said that, if you are an SME, but you are first tier to a large company, you probably will be dragged in ASAP, namely 2024, reporting in 2025 for the large companies. If you supply large companies, this you'll be dragged in already. Yeah? But besides CSRD, you look at Green Deal agenda, climate neutral Europe, circular economy, building renovation, zero pollution. The list is endless. And those points will not come to you via CSRD. They will come to you via other points of legislation. So you can look at CSRD and think, oh, this will only affect my reporting as small, medium-sized enterprise in 2027 or 2028. No way. You will be hit by due diligence requirements coming to you via packaging regulation, battery regulation, eco design, etc., etc. I think the main driver for your change will be product compliance first, and then you will realize this is all interconnected. So I better start to have an overall approach, which you could then cover with under CSRD. Yeah. Look at timber regulation. EU timber legislation last month became EU deforestation-free products regulation. That is not a simple agenda topic. It has really significant impact, which basically means that if you have a piece of land where you illegally harvested forest, and then you grow, for example, soy on that soil, and with that soil you feed cattle, and then you use the leather of the cattle to make a leather couch, you should not. That leather comes from animals fed from a illegal harvested forest. That's basically what deforestation-free products regulation is. Wow, that means you need to go up to the supply chain. Well, at least one tier, and acknowledge that that one is going to go down to the rabbit hole somewhere. Yeah. So don't look at the timing just because of CSRD timing. That's my point. And all these new legislation have transparency built in. Due diligence, risk assessment, risk mitigation, conformity declarations, mandatory reporting, with digital product passport. as like a central point. So the principle of a digital product passport, a QR code that travels with a product, allowing the end user, you and me, after work as consumers, to dive a little bit into the conformity of that product and the supply chain. This is not something that you can repair in a later stage. You can say, okay, we didn't make up a declaration of conformity and nobody asking for it, and then suddenly we get a request from market surveillance authorities. So what we do now, okay, let's make a declaration of conformity and then solve that issue. Well, it's one way of looking at product compliance. But with digital product passport, it should already be there. You cannot repair it anymore. And that requires time, because if packaging regulation, it will be signed off later this year, and then you have 12 months plus 20 days to start working on that. Even if it's by the end of this year, you are looking at 12 months into a supply chain that's actually already buying 9 or 12 months ahead. So this means change during change. And what we tell our customers, if you want to have a maturity model for your supply chain, you better start to act fast, because the time for maturity is really gone. So it will really lead to tough decisions. The other thing is, if you rely solely on others to do audits for you, then you won't be the only one solely requiring for others to do audits. There won't be enough audit capacity. That means that you need to start looking for, that's what we're going to offer as well, self-assessment options for the supply chain. And if supply chain due diligence is done by supply chain themselves, but you can validate that basically on information that's coming per order, then it makes perfectly sense. If you just look on the front page of audit reports and everything is okay, but you don't look into the content of product conformity based on orders, then you will be in trouble. So it needs to be like an interwoven approach. You cannot do A without B. Where to start? Well, we had a presentation 2 weeks ago with Sebastian Pivet of A.S. Watson in Hong Kong. And there were also the APAC directors for FSC and Amphori there. And it was quite enlightening. And thank you, Sebastian, that we could use part of the information that you presented in the slides. Basically, as a structure, it helps. So I would recommend, and I can tell you, Product IP is going through the same process as you, because we are first-tier supplier to many of those that have, are under Lieferkette Gesetz in Germany or are affected by CSRD. There are 17 UN Sustainability Development Goals. And I really recommend that you find some time in your calendar, and it doesn't need to be this week, but make an appointment with yourself to really look at those goals. And those goals, they are there in 17, and they all have a pop-up window and come with more information. And they are equally important. Yeah, it's just 1 to 17. They're equally important. And some of them are really low-hanging fruit, and some are very, very difficult. The good thing is, don't think that when you put pressure on the supply chain, that it's just you putting pressure on the supply chain. These 17, and actually what Sebastian told us is that actually in many a case and many communication and platforms discussions, people are actually already referring to those numbers. So how are you approaching number 6, UN 6 or UN 12? So these numbers become synonymous for certain aspects. You could also say there are certain topics in CSR or in general legislation that you can then make a relation back to those UN goals. Very clear, greenhouse gases. You can say which items on the UN 17 agenda have to do with greenhouse gases or climate gases, affordable energy, climate action, partnership for the goals. That number 17 is often there because you cannot just solve it by yourself. So I've just stole from Sebastian a couple of those combinations that they as A.S. Watson make to communicate internally. First and foremost, internally and then externally. Yeah, and if you have, which is the same with product compliance, if you don't have your communication clear internally, it's very, very difficult to communicate clearly externally. So climate crisis also has waste management and circular economy. Yeah, different agenda points, but still under climate crisis. Then you come with zero hunger, responsible consumption and production, life below water, life on land, partnership on the goals. The partnership for the goals is very, very relevant. You know? It's actually almost always there. Social compliance. There you already see some aspects here are a little bit more beyond the regular CSR ESG agenda. Social compliance under corporate sustainability reporting has not just to do with policies for you and the first year, but also the impact that it has further down the supply chain. So if you are dealing with factories and that factory in principle looks great, but the impact it has on the environment further downstream in that country also has to have some impact. So really complex, but don't start with all the loose ends at the end. Start with what you know for sure, which is your own company first. Yeah, so I can go quickly over these slides and you will get the slides. And if you know this principle, it starts to make sense. There's no right or wrong in this. You know, you could divert from this approach, but it helps to understand which of those chapters are actually intertwined, interlinked with higher level topics. That's my point about this. Yeah. And the number 17, partnership for the goals, is always there. So how to approach CSRD in general? It's like with product compliance. You don't start with products, you start with suppliers. With CSRD, with sustainability, you don't start with legislation. You start with mapping out your policies. Companies have policies, purchasing policies, human resource policies. Be clear on your policies. They are not right or wrong at this moment. They are there, and they are there because of a purpose. But now you need to, you know, when you have them, you need to flip them over and see what is the consequence of those actions with respect to CSR ESG agenda. So map your policies, map the impact of these policies, start mitigating risk, because you will find that there's low-hanging fruit, and I'll have an example for that. And then determine the effectiveness of your actions and report on that. That is basically the approach on the CSRD. No policies, or so no mapping is not possible because you cannot set goals. The EU has not yet clearly defined like a minimum threshold of progress, but it will be there and it will be made, and there will be a kind of a standard reporting in terms of KPIs. But this starts with this, and I'll give you an example how you could do it. And this has to do with internal things. It's like if we buy paper, do we buy paper, or do we buy FSC or similar paper? Is that a policy? Yeah, it's a policy. And if we hire or rent new cars, or we have new lease contracts, are we choosing for a certain means of transport or not? And if we fly, do we compensate or don't we fly? Or these are policies, and policies make a difference, and change of a policy makes a difference. Yeah. So very simple example. The policy of payment. Yeah. You have as a company a payment policy. In fact, there is even a European legislation with respect to payment policies, which makes sense because delaying of payments actually has a tremendous effect, especially on small and medium-sized enterprises, because you are affecting cash flow. And cash flow could be fundamentally disruptive for small and medium-sized enterprises. That's why we have a directive from 2011 on payment policies in the European Union. The fact that you didn't know that doesn't mean it is not there. Yeah. So delaying payments, and God knows that we are doing that, actually is a policy in many companies. And this is one of those policies that you need to review, because thousands of businesses are having a tremendous administrative and financial burden because you pay late. And actually, what doesn't help? Cash flow? Really? Just one time? Is this low-hanging fruit? Could you just start paying within 14 days, within 1 week? We have, as Polycopy, customers that actually manage that perfectly well within 14 days. And I applaud you, because we were a very small company and it really was making a big difference to receive payment on time. That is what I mean with reviewing policies, payment policies, hiring policies, renting policies, being aware of the actions that you take and the consequences of those actions, and then determine if there is low-hanging fruit and make progress. So, what is your payment policy? Of course, some of those aspects that are CSRD related come from products and actually related to industries. If you are having furniture, then obviously you probably have wood, and the timber regulation, deforestation-free products is going to affect you a little bit more. That's when you have electronics. But if you have electronics, you might run into batteries. You probably run into heavy metals with respect to the ROS legislation. You could also look at design of products and think, if the basic principle of these PCBs always requires soldering of lead wires to the PCBs instead of connectors, these are simple changes that mitigate risk on non-compliance, because using lead solder for hand soldering is much easier than lead-free soldering. This is the thing that I mean when I talk about policies and product related. The apparel industry, it was like 10 years ago, last week when we had the Bangladeshi tragedy. It's definitely one of those industries that even made their own agreements already on how to mitigate risks. In Polycopy, you will see on the supplier profile side, I'm talking about Q3, Q4, significant changes where we know in what segments you make technical files, and therefore we know in what kind of industries you basically are making technical files, and we will present you with risk assessments related to that, so you can start to do part of the due diligence. Which will make it interesting, and our team is new on that aspect, but it's experienced and dedicated, new for you and new for us, and we'll continue to surprise you in the second half of this year on that. But different industries, different risks. Packaging is one of those policies. Are you buying products with the packaging that is available in the market from your suppliers? Then you have a certain risk about non-compliance with packaging legislation, but also with your goals. If you always choose what is there rather than design your own packaging concepts, then this could be a policy change. Different industries, obviously, different risks. That also means when you start to move into a new industry, you need to be aware that you are sometimes getting a delay in your progress, because you need to really start to dive into the new risk. It makes it very difficult for large companies just to go to the Canton Fair and buy 3 containers of XYZ. Really, it makes it complex. Having said that, importers that are dedicated to certain product categories, industries, and know about those risks can demonstrate their added value. So I don't think there's a scarcity of compliance goods coming from a conformity supply chain. It's just a reshuffle of how these goods end up at my doorstep or in the shelf at the store. So looking at products, some products are very clear. It's just like a first tier supplier. Sometimes you really need to dive into the whole supply chain, and the battery regulation is one of those that requires, especially those that will sell large battery packs, could be automotive related or just power storage systems, to really go to the mine, to the source of certain minerals. Yeah. There you can see that actually the due diligence part is not clearly described in CSRD and batteries. It's described in battery regulation, but it has parallels. Not knowing who your first tier are, or knowing who your first tier supplier is, but knowing that they don't know who the second or third is, will run into trouble. So mapping your supply chain is really something that you should start doing. With whom are we dealing? Do we know who they are? Do we have a copy of their business license? Are we really sending money to those that we buy goods from? Be sure about it, because if you're not sure about your first tier, how the hell are you going to look into second tier? Is it really their second tier? Yeah. You need to really start making an effort in mapping. Other things of low-hanging fruit is, if you go to substances, it might be very difficult to say, okay, we don't want any phthalates in products. It's a generic group of phthalates, which is quite complex. Oh, we don't want any POPs, and that's for sure, it's not allowed, so that's legislation. And what you could do is, you could say as a company policy, we're going to strive to avoid any CMRs. And CMRs are substances that could lead to cancer, or mutagene toxic or reprotoxic. These are banned from toys and childcare products anyway. So that means there are alternatives. And if you know what substances are used in products with CAS numbers, you can look up CAS numbers at the ECHA database, the REACH database, and see if a substance is a C, an M, or an R. So making a policy saying in X years we want to have no CMRs in our product is a clear policy. Yeah. Or move from solvent-based paint to water-based paints. And I know some companies that have done that, which reduces the risk of the product entirely as well, not only for the supply chain. Reducing packaging footprint, looking at repairability, looking at recyclability. Yeah. So this moment, we often get questions in the last 4 or 5 years. Can we solder a battery on a PCB, yes or no? Yeah, you can. But why? You know, you can, but you shouldn't. It's low-hanging fruit. Why? Yeah, everybody does it. Yeah. So these are policies that come from products. And again, the good thing is you will not be the only company that putting pressure on the supply chain. And so it's not a movement as people movement. It's a move of an entire way how we produce products that will help you as well. Yeah. I want to dive into one thing, which is a tremendous, popular topic to discuss: GHG, greenhouse gases, and how to reduce the impact, the carbon footprint of our company. And then they often talk about scope 1, scope 2, scope 3. Just to give you a little bit heads up on what this language actually means. Scope 1 is quite easy. It has everything to do with your own company. So you can make your own decisions. Where am I buying energy? How do we drive our vehicles? It's everything that is in contracts assigned by yourself. So this is where you are entirely responsible for a change just by making a different choice. Scope 2, it's already a little bit complex, but not entirely. Sometimes you are renting, or sometimes you have a product, process somewhere. You have warehouse, you have cooling. It's a little bit more complex than 1 because it's impacting and it's like indirect. Sometimes you need to change the way you are doing things, but it's still possible. But not all companies are being able to have a tremendous impact on scope 2 because it's, it depends on certain projects. Processes. But scope 1 and scope 2 in total is just a few percentage of your energy consumption, because most of the energy consumption and therefore the carbon footprint comes from scope 3. And scope 3 have an upstream and a downstream leg. Has to do with everything that, lease facilities, employee commuting, business travel. That's still in your house. You still can do that. You have things that you can do without operational waste. You still can reduce waste or recycle waste or participate. And then you go into purchased goods and services, capital goods, transport and distribution. Oh, it becomes a little bit complex here. It is because you are going to influence other companies with your decision. Having said that, if you have governments, EU governments, municipalities as your customers, they will start to award you with points if they can have an impact on scope 3, obviously, because that is how they procure. And it also has to do with downstream, also your transportation, processing of sold products, use of sold products, that's like the return goods, end of life, again, lease facilities, franchises, and investment. So it has to do with money as well. Scope 3 is the most difficult one. And often you can see claims of companies around what they are doing. And then they say, we have a goal with respect to scope 1 or scope 2. Yeah. You can see also scope 2 is a little bit outside the main event because it doesn't apply to everybody. So how could that look? So you could say, and that is often what you see. We see scope 1 and 2. This is absolute contraction. That means a reduction that we can actually clearly measure because it's in our own energy bookkeeping, basically. So we could say a target is we're going to reduce scope 1 and 2 emission by X%, 50 is not bad, by 2030. That 2030 is the Green Deal time, 50% from a year. 50% towards what? 220, 218, something. And so you have a reduction in 2030 realized by X% comparing to a year. That is a goal. That is a target. You write the target down like something like that. And then you start to change your policies and measure the results. Don't forget, if you're doing things right, your company is still growing. So you have more to reduce compared to the size of the company you had in that year. Yeah. And then under 3, you have 2 parts because you have a lag that is relevant for yourself and you have one that is involved in supplier engagement. And that is, of course, the most difficult lag. But again, you can reduce scope 3 emissions from, for example, purchased goods and services and upstream transportation distribution. These are the tools that are close to your business. I'm buying goods, I can have an opinion about that. I'm buying services, I can have an opinion about that. And when I have the goods and they arrive at my warehouse, I use certain means to transport and distribute them or even sell them. Yeah. Again, an X% per Y value added by 2030 from a base. So it's always, I want to reduce something compared to something. Yeah. Otherwise, you cannot set your goals. This is the way they do it. 3, intensity is already something to really write that down. It will take more than one afternoon with some beer and cheese to really write that down, because probably you have no idea what it is today. And then supplier engagement. Well, now you need to know, I'm getting my goods from A, but actually they are made at B, and B is where, and B is buying parts from C, and C is where, and what is the means of transport? And there are a lot of databases that you can use to calculate those carbon footprints, and there are estimates that you could use, but it only makes sense if you have a clear picture of first tier, second tier of your supply chain per product categories, right? Start with 1 and 2, and then I could say start with 3A, and then start to work on 3B later. But don't forget it. What about phasing on CSRD? Because I already see about questions. How will or must businesses set KPIs be checked by authorities and the public? I'm coming to that. And how about companies that have their headquarters in Japan and only sales, marketing, and warehouses in the EU? They count only the EU office employees for CSRD. Well, if you have an EU entity with plus 500 staff, current NFRD scope, then you need to start in 2025 reporting over 2024. Then all the other large enterprises, plus 250 staff, 50 million net turnover in Europe, or 20 million assets in Europe. You start in 2026 with 2025 data. So perhaps that answers the question. Does that company has an office in the EU and that EU office is making more than 40 million net turnover? It's anyway, or that staff or that, then you are probably in that category. Otherwise, you could be an SME and you need to start with 2026 data. What about if the company is just selling products in the EU and doesn't have any entities here? You're also still involved. You can have drop shipping, but if you are a non-EU enterprise with a net turnover of over 150 million, you need to comply in 2028 to 2027 data. So your question about how about companies that have their headquarters in Japan, I think in that case, you could say maybe CSRD is coming later, but if you are selling to companies that are in the first scope, you'll probably be affected as SMEs are, or you'll be affected by product legislation. You anyway be affected by this agenda. Mapping your supply chain is first. Is there an escape for SMEs? Yeah, there is an escape. They can still opt out till 2028. You just have to mention why. I think it's relevant. There's small service companies that can say, listen, I'm just a one-man band. To go all over this effort doesn't really make sense. But what I have done is I've made certain policy choices. I'm using this kind of transportation, XYZ. I'm using, I'm buying this kind of paper, some small things. But you cannot just say nothing. You need to tell you why in your case, you don't want to do the entire effort. So you have to mention basically why you want to opt out. It's now still till 28. Might be a little bit longer for that. But the chances are that you are actually the first tier to large enterprises and get a Q&A anyway from them. Or you might be a small importer, but you will get due diligence and reporting requirements from product-based legislation. So regardless if you think CSRD is relevant for you, start mapping your supply chain. That is my entire point. Be clear on with whom you are doing business. Yeah. So start mapping your supply chain. First tier. Who are they? Do I have a copy of the business license, etc. Then start to build quality information around products. Chemical compositions, for example. The level of information that are in technical files, also in product be around bill of materials, bill of substances, and or safety data sheets, has significant room for improvement. Why aren't they up to level? Because there's no consequences from you wiring money to those that supply you with inadequate information. Don't blame the organization that just collects the information. Don't blame the email service provider that the attachments are not up to standard. That's basically here. You need to have a policy and be clear in communication of the policy. And again, the whole supply chain will start to demand more clear information on chemical composition and also second tier. Where are those first tier suppliers actually getting their parts from? Yeah. A third one, start implementing a packaging footprint policy. Very clear. And then number 4 is, I think it's mind opener. Maybe it should put it in number 1. Look at those UN chapters with your own team and then apply them on yourself. And I can tell you, that is an interesting, a very interesting game. We are not different than you as Product FB. So we are not better or worse. We are just a company. And reading those UN chapters is an eye-opener. It's simply like that. And then you need to think, okay, there's work to be done. Start working on your own house first before you ask others to work on their house. Scope 1, greenhouse gases, is really low-hanging fruit. Real effort will be, and I'm talking about months of efforts to realize that you actually have policies. And where are they? And it's one thing to say, we have written down our policies in this handbook. Yeah, great. Now at least you know where they are. But then look at them through the glasses of the UN chapters and think, are these policies in one way or another affecting any of these chapters, and are they low-hanging fruit? Could we change the policies? That would be interesting, because then we can, you know, make progress in the early years, where we can maybe piggyback ride a little bit on the entire supply chain, putting the pressure on the entire supply chain in 2007, 28, 29, right? Make impact analysis. Wow. Is it difficult? Well, it's not difficult to read UN chapters. It's really not difficult. It's really, you know, plain English. Is it work? Oh yeah, it's definitely work. Will it lead to change in your organization? If not, sell the company today. It definitely will have tremendous change. It cannot be not changing the way you do business. Okay, what about due diligence? Well, I'm not a fan of either of them, in the sense that I prefer any of them, but I do realize, of course, I prefer product FP, but that's just a standard. But you cannot do this by yourself. It's impossible. You need help with, and it could be TIC inspecting and auditing certain aspects. You could ask certain part of supply chain to be certified. That is the most significant part. But there will be consequences to check if they are certified or not, or they have in breach of the certification requirements. So you need to understand how FSC works, or PAFC, how they do their business. You could choose to join Amfori, or you could choose to follow SA 8000 principle. There's no good or bad. They all use a similar approach. FSC and PAFC, you know, they do the same kind of thing, and it's just a different word for it. Yeah. And of course, you can look at, there was the question about how you can set certain KPIs. There are certain benchmark figures coming, for example, on industries and carbon footprints. So, you know, to know what is the benchmark is one thing, but to measure if you are up to the benchmark or not is really something else. Yeah. And there are things called science-based targets, and there will be more information coming from Product FP towards, okay, how can we deal with life cycle analysis or carbon footprints? I don't think that is the aspect that I would start with first, as a small and medium-sized enterprises. That is a too complex policy. Yeah. That is about CSRD for today. There still highlight on technical documentation why it's relevant, and that has to do with the new product liability directive, November 21st. After there's still one session, packaging, for in next month before the summer holidays, and then, or do we also have machinery? Machinery is also a new regulation. But then we also have no compliance Tuesdays after the summer holidays, and the 21st one will be together with Roche Law on product liability directive. That would be a typical one to also add others. Don't just invite your own team for these compliance Tuesdays. If all this legislation requires others in your team, from legal, from finance, consultants, accountants, if they have no idea what you talk about, why you don't invite them to compliance Tuesdays and share? We will put this, my face and voice and my story on YouTube later as well. And start sharing, because you cannot do it just by yourself. That is it for me for today. Compliance Tuesdays. Stay informed, check your email preference with us, download the apps. There's no more questions in Menti for now, just over 1 hour. Nothing in the chat. Good bunch of people, thanks. Have a good lunch, and contact me in the coming days when you get the presentation and the FAQ from the other sessions as well, if you are running into new questions for us. Yep. Thanks. Bye-bye.